As opposed to what many might expect, the Call of Duty franchise was initially a campaign-driven experience. Entries 1, 2 and 3 all had their respective multiplayer modes, but it was their campaigns that were the real meat of the package. At a time where the World War II genre was becoming saturated with daring load missions into enemy territory and secret operations in the heart of the Reich, Call of Duty sprung up as a more grounded and air quotes realistic depiction of the war. You were no longer one single soldier being ferried along to a number of top secret escapades, but a foot soldier in a squad trying to survive. Your objectives weren't exotic either. Quite often you were being tasked with taking a village or holding off an enemy attack, never feeling too over the top or out of place. Another key facet was how the campaign was structured, with the first 3 mainline entries taking place across a number of different locales and military forces, with the British Army in North Africa to the Russian battles of Stalingrad. It was a surprisingly fresh take on the genre, one that would prove to be hugely popular. In this video, I would like to explore the themes and motifs that pervaded the early entries in the Call of Duty franchise. Themes of war, bravery and death. I would then like to compare and critique some of the later games, specifically Modern Warfare 2, and how they took these themes and skewed them, in the process losing much of what made the earlier games special. Now, Call of Duty has never been quote-unquote realistic by any stretch, but the early games in the franchise always had a grounded sense of what they were and what they represented. They were depicting the most devastating war in history, which the player was only a very small part of, and it did that fairly well. Whilst the hardware at the time was limited, they did an admirable job of making you feel like a foot soldier in this gargantuan conflict through set pieces, multiple protagonists and swirling orchestral scores. They had an historical conflict to respect, and the games were mostly very self-aware of that. The player is never really made to feel like the most important cog in the war machine. It's generally about working together as part of a unit and of a greater coalition to complete relatively small objectives that assist in the larger plan. And this extends to more than just working with your fellow GI. The switching of perspectives throughout the first 3 games is integral, not only to the gameplay experience, offering different environments and weapons, but also to the wider MO. That being that the Second World War was not won by solo acts of individual heroism, although there are many cases of that, but that the Second World War was won by the grit and determination of a global unified military force that had set aside ideological and cultural differences in order to defeat a collective of objectively evil and hateful regimes. And this was a theme that many of its contemporaries at the time weren't interested in, or couldn't pull off. They were more focused on providing the player with the power fantasy. You were the hero, outnumbered and outgunned, deep behind enemy lines, completing top secret missions of sabotage, espionage and assassination. Those games framed your actions as monumental victories to the war effort. This was likely due to the hardware at the time not allowing you to have large open battles with multiple NPCs and effects, yet was also likely down to the influence of films such as Where Eagles Dare and The Guns of Navarone. Films primarily focused on the actions of a few highly skilled and brave elite operatives. Jimmy Patterson from the Medal of Honor franchise was a named hero. The player is made to feel like their actions had a lasting and imperative effect on the conflict as a whole. In the first Call of Duty, the American protagonist is known only as Private Martin, and he's just a guy in a squad. The player's actions are still made to feel important and impactful because they are. The war effort would have been for nothing if all the individual components didn't come together and succeed. But the framing and context of these actions is far less about how great the player is, although there's plenty of that given that it's a video game, and more to do about what you have done, or what you will be doing, in order to assist the efforts of other unseen allies.
"50,000 people used to live here. Now it's a ghost town."
Aside from the more character-centric narrative that the first Modern Warfare employed, it also changed the framing of the action somewhat. Call of Duty 4, having a fictional conflict, allowed the developers to craft a slightly more outlandish story with nuclear weapons, Russian ultranationalists and all that. However, it mostly maintained the composed, self-aware nature of previous titles. The battles looked and felt grounded for the most part, although that did change somewhat towards the final climactic assault on the missile base. The special ops missions with the SAS were made to feel like you were a member of a highly skilled team of soldiers that mainly operated under the cover of darkness and away from media coverage. The American Marine campaign is far more set on having the player take part in much more public and explosive urban battles, alongside tanks and air support, taking inspiration from movies such as Ridley Scott's Black Hawk Down to deliver a far more emotional theme. This is in line with how both of these factions are handled in previous games too. The American campaigns were always centred on the camaraderie between men who were just your normal everyday Joe Blogs, thrust into circumstances that were thoroughly beyond their control and asked to fight and succeed for their country. The British campaigns were initially based on the sort of covert operations that define the experiences found in Modern Warfare, sabotage and lightning-fast strikes. Later entries would again lean on the camaraderie found in the American campaign, but with that cynical British twist that you so often see. If you were to look at the Call of Duty 4 campaign on a surface level, it would be easy to assume that it is both pro-interventionism and as a result, pro-war. The Marines can easily be viewed as the good guys, the Western saviours, especially early on. They are, after all, invading an oil-rich Middle Eastern state after the president is killed in a coup d'etat and usurped by a group of extreme anti-West separatists who are potentially in possession of a nuclear weapon. You are there to stop al-Assad, the villain, before he has a chance to use this WMD against you and your allies. Sound familiar? Well, the similarities between this conflict and the Iraq War, which was still going on in 2007, is lost on basically no one. It's definitely what the developers were going for, but there's more to it than a simple comparison to what was a contemporary conflict. This game was released at just the right time to act as an effective platform for the growing mistrust and unease that characterises the post-9/11 years. As time has gone on, Call of Duty 4 has been seen by many to be somewhat of a criticism of not only the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, but of Western foreign policy as a whole. The US, and its allies, intervenes and invades a country using military might, shock and awe, and sheer firepower to overcome any resistance. In the context of Modern Warfare, it is handled fairly respectfully. They aren't labelled as the bad guys. Al-Assad does seem to be a real threat to the West, and I would assume that this is due to the very conflicts that this game is commenting on still raging on. People from all sides were still being killed daily, so there was a certain level of respect that had to be met, even if the sentiment was one of criticism. But missions like Death from Above were used as a commentary to the, at the time, recently revealed infrared footage of gunship strikes in the Middle East. There's quite a substantial amount of disconnect in that mission. You feel removed from the deaths of the men you're killing. There's no music, no sounds of explosions or general battlefield ambience, just the hum of the monitors and the rumble of the engines, interspersed with the thuds of weaponry and the cold confirmation of how many men you've just killed. This comes in the second act of the game too, after hours and hours of face-to-face fighting. When the nuclear device does finally go off, killing tens of thousands of US troops and potentially millions of civilians, you could view this, if you are inclined, to be a message about how it's not always the right or just thing for the West to intervene in the politics or conflicts of other nations, even if they potentially have a WMD. That it should be the decision of the UN or NATO as a whole as to whether or not action should be taken, and not decided upon by a handful of states. It's an allegory somewhat to the response to the Iraq War, which was pretty much overwhelmingly negative. And it arrives around the midpoint of the game, right around the height of success that the US has been having narratively. They had successfully done everything they wanted to, more or less, and hell, one more daring objective to rescue a downed pilot won't hurt anyone, right? Well, yeah. This moment serves as not only a cornerstone for the series in terms of political commentary, but for the industry as a whole. This was Modern Warfare's updated and contemporary take on the themes of the series. The Second World War is viewed by the majority as being one of the last just wars. A war which had to be fought against a common enemy of not just individual countries, but of the entire species. There's a reason that generation is often called the Greatest Generation. They went to war, gave their lives for their country, not necessarily out of choice or for glory, but out of a will to fight back against an expanding evil. The original Call of Duties knew this and used it to frame the conflict in a heroic but almost impersonal way. Modern Warfare took those ideas and skewed them somewhat for the modern era. It questions wars, questions the method and manner in which wars are carried out. It's still a grounded, respectful setting, but it has underlying criticisms of foreign policy sprinkled throughout. But why am I talking about this though? Why is the thematic reasoning and framing for Call of Duty games important? Well, it has to do with how you view video games as a whole really, what their purpose is and what they can do with their medium. Many people, and much of the non-technologically orientated press, tend to view games as just mindless, generally violent forms of escapist media, that they hold no artistic value, no weight, and no sense of introspection. But, I disagree with this sentiment, and find that video games can and often do have meaningful undercurrents. Now, this isn't to say that they all do, or in fact all should, not at all, but it's something to keep in mind when viewing or looking back on titles, such as Modern Warfare 2 for instance. A game which does still attempt some semblance of commentary and context, yet handles it in a much more obtuse fashion, and more importantly, not very successfully. In the second mission of the game, Team Player, you board a Humvee as the gunner and set off into the city. That is, however, not before showcasing perhaps the game's most effective instance of the introspection and critique that I've just been outlining. This scene, I think, is a commentary on the USA's and Allies' technological and aviational superiority that it often employs when fighting in the Middle East and anywhere else overseas for that matter. Your regiment, well actually it's just General Shepard, calls in an airstrike on a tower block that the militia you were just fighting have retreated to. The men around you comment on how close that is to you. You are, after all, pretty close to a strike that is intended to level a tower block, to which another replies, "When has Shepard ever cared about danger close?" Fitting, given the events to come later in the game. However, that's not the important part about the scene. Not really. I think that is the reaction of the men around you to a strike that not only destroys the building it was aiming for, but seriously damages and levels most of the block. Cheers and whoops and hollers are heard all around. The men you are fighting alongside wanted to see this. They wanted to see their enemy destroyed in such a manner, out of their control and, in a way, out of mind. Now, I'm not a military man, as you can probably tell, but does this kind of thing happen? Is this the kind of event that would warrant cheers and congratulations from men on the ground? Well, I would guess maybe it is. War is war, and some may have just seen their best friends killed by the bullets fired by the men they just obliterated in such an abstracted way. I have no place in critiquing the actions and reactions of real military strategies, regardless of if I agree with them. Not just because I am, not a soldier or ex-soldier, but because it's not the point of this video. I can, however, look into it with the context of a video game, and in this case, I can't figure out if this is either a commentary on American foreign policy, or just dumb spectacle, or actually, more sinisterly, actual praise and almost celebration of American military might. The opening cinematic to this level is a very descriptive and almost self-relating overview of the US war machine. It pulls no punches in hammering home how powerful and almost totalitarian it is. For the longest time, I just saw this as Shepard, the one giving the speech, congratulating himself somewhat as if it were his doing, which would make sense thematically, I suppose. The more I think about this, however, the more I'm torn. If it is a commentary, then it's not very well delivered, nor followed up on in any meaningful way given the rest of the game's apparent lack of such context and commentary. Yet, if it is in fact supporting and celebrating the actions of the US and friends overseas, then I'm somewhat shaken as to what drove the developers to include it in their game. Was it money? The effects of which had driven Activision to pursue a pro-American and subsequently pro-war stance? Maybe. I mean, COD 4 was a monumental success on its release. It made a whole lot of cash and expanded the already vast fanbase to an unprecedented scale. This must have brought on board some very lucrative sponsors and shareholders. The influence of these new benefactors may have had the military in mind when they decided to fund the project, deciding against the angsty and critical approach the original Modern Warfare took with the series in favour of a more pro-war agenda. Not necessarily in-your-face pro-war, but subtle enough that it might inspire the mostly young male demographic that plays the games to sign up. I'm not entirely sure. And hey, it still might just be dumb fucking spectacle, and if it isn't a commentary, that is most certainly the preferred alternative. Whilst an ambiguous scene, it is in my opinion the most effective in portraying those weird pseudo-criticisms that the original Call of Duty 4 used. The same can't be said for the rest of the game, however. In particular, and perhaps most obviously, the infamous No Russian mission. This is where this game made its mark. One of the most infamous and controversial first-person shooter levels in history, which sounds like a lot of hyperbole, but really this level was a massive deal back in 2009, and for many years later. The mission is what your character, Private Allen, has been selected by General Shepard for. A mass shooting at the Zakhaev International Airport. A fictional location with the implications of a real place. Orchestrated by the villain, Vladimir Makarov, to stir up yet more chaos in his own country. He mutters at the start of the level the timelessly ambiguous line, "Remember, no Russian." The first 5 to 10 minutes are, bluntly, pretty horrific and extremely violent. Scores of innocent people mown down by 5 armor-clad lunatics with fully automatic weapons. Now, this was pretty edgy, even back in 2009, and drew heavy criticism from the press and critics for its seemingly needless brutality. So, I'm going to look at this level from a couple of different angles. Narratively, this does serve a purpose somewhat in advancing the story, and of the first 4 missions in the game, it is the one that has the most impact. It essentially sets up the events of not only the rest of Modern Warfare 2, but also of Modern Warfare 3. Do I think it was necessary to be a playable event? Well, I'm not sure. Mohammed Alavi, who was the developer responsible for missions such as Crew Expendable and All Gillied Up from Modern Warfare, was integral to its design. He wanted the level to explain why Russia would attack the US in the first place, as well as set up a link between the player's actions and the consequences of them. He felt that the player should feel an emotional connection to both the narrative and to Makarov. And, that's a good idea. I'm 100% behind video games using the interactivity that the medium gives to provide a narrative experience of show rather than tell. That's why a series such as Half-Life are so endearing. There's no reams and reams of exposition-heavy cutscenes. The player is in control all the time and is taught about the plot and the gameplay through events that they partake in and observe. It's a great mantra to develop by, and I wish more AAA games would use it. However, No Russian, I feel, was the wrong way to approach this. Other than the narrative and design purpose, it was quite obviously an attempt to both mimic a twist or shock moment similar to the nuclear blast in 4, and also artificially create controversy for the sake of publicity. After all, any publicity is good publicity, and you can bet your ass that this game got some fairly heavy coverage upon the showcase of this level. Many outlets were critical of the sheer level of violence and realism that the level showcased, especially in the midst of events such as 9/11, the 7/7 bombings, and the 2008 Mumbai attacks. It was viewed as senseless by many, especially in the era of uncertainty that began in 2001. It was obviously intended to shock and in some ways appall its players. After all, terrorism is something that a lot of people feel very strongly about. It's a situation no one wants to be in. This is especially obvious in No Russian. They specifically chose a location that many people already associate with terrorism, and let the player be the ones to commit the slaughter. Many actually defend this level, based on not only the lack of any explicit instruction to kill civilians, the apparent absence of any notice the other perpetrators pay to you if you do not, and the option the game provides you both before and during the mission to skip it entirely. And these are fair enough points too. It is true that the game doesn't egg you on to partake in the shooting. In fact, during my playthrough for the mission, I made an active attempt to only find my weapon when I was sure I had to in order to progress. And yeah, it does let you skip it with basically no detriment to the game. However, does that excuse it? Not only as a piece of media, but simply as a mission? Well, I'm in the mindset that it doesn't really. Firstly, purely from the perspective of narrative and gameplay, it poorly delivers on its plan to make the player feel connected to the story in any meaningful way. Not that it doesn't try, and I actually want to defend the level somewhat here for at least attempting some level of commentary and background to the events that are to unfold later in the game, in which the Russian government find the body of one American at the scene of what must be the most brutal terror attack ever put to screen, and pin responsibility solely on the US, declaring war and invading only a day or two later, apparently omitting the bodies of the other 2 shooters killed in the attack, who are for all intents and purposes Russian, and also ignoring all CCTV footage which clearly shows Makarov at the helm. Many people point this out to be a major plot hole in the story of Modern Warfare 2, and in many ways it is. Just don't forget though that this is not unlike the response the USA had in the aftermath of 9/11, albeit with a much more protracted time span. The invasion of Iraq is seen by quite a few as being in response to that event. But wait, I hear you saying, with all of the defense and credit you've given the series thus far for being critical of such interventionism and militarization, why is this level not one of your favourites, for showcasing it front and centre? And, well, because the level was a piece of crass marketing, not an important piece of commentary. It was meant to stir controversy, manufactured to bring attention to the title and make Activision lots of money. And I disagree with that tactic pretty wholeheartedly. I know this is the case too, firstly because of how the level unfolds. Because after the slaughter, you make your way outside and are forced, and actually forced this time, to fight wave after wave of FSB soldiers responding to your attack. Even if the previous section had been somewhat successful in its attempts at shock and commentary, the inclusion of this section would unravel that, and it just makes it feel even more tasteless. The second reason, I'm sure this is marketing and not really anything substantial, is the fact that they turned the level into a multiplayer map. Now, I love Terminal as much as the next person. It's a great multiplayer map and one of the best in the series, but its inclusion as a direct tie-in to the single player just proves wholeheartedly that Activision never really cared about making any sort of political or social commentary. They cared about making cool, artificially shocking moments to grab media attention, and, more importantly, they cared about making money. I know that was quite a chunky tangent, but it's important, because it was after this level, and subsequently this title, that Call of Duty really started to fall away from the themes that were being outlined earlier in the video. Themes of camaraderie against a mutual evil, or of being a cog in the larger machine. Even the updated takes from Modern Warfare and how that game started to critique the purpose of war and how it's enacted in the 21st century. All of that started to fall away as they lent more on bombastic action, paper-thin cartoony villains, and stereotypes. Not that all games have to be super serious or philosophical or anything, but that last part especially comes up when discussing some of the missions around Modern Warfare 2, and even the 2019 reboot. In the Modern Warfare 2 level Takedown, the mission that directly succeeds No Russian, the player is tasked with finding an arms dealer called Rojas in the Rio favelas, and, well, it doesn't really handle things very well. There's sometimes a sentiment that Call of Duty games can be a bit racist, or at least they used to be, and it's not to do with some obnoxious asshats online using racial slurs. It's in the depiction of other countries that these games have found some controversy. For example, in his excellent critique of the Call of Duty single-player campaigns, game analysis auteur Noah Gervais, link below, makes a good argument for how the Modern Warfare 3 sequence set in Somalia is a bit racist. And it's not because it's outright trying to be, or that it hates people of colour, but because it plays into Western media tropes of that area of the world. The same media that only ever mentions Somalia either when remembering the catastrophic failure of the American intervention in the region, or when talking about pirates. So, when you go to Somalia in Modern Warfare 3, of course you're fighting a militia of pirates. And Modern Warfare 2 is no different in its portrayal of Rio de Janeiro, and more importantly, the favelas. When you enter, you're pretty much immediately met with resistance from the local militia. But unlike a game such as Max Payne 3, where it clearly outlines the militia as a gang, has them with strong story implications and a written functioning leader, the militia in Modern Warfare 2 is there because it's a favela. So of course they're there. There's no background, no crime boss, no name to this gang, and certainly no story implications. For all intents and purposes, they're bad because the game says so. Also, in terms of numbers, you basically kill everyone in the settlement. It's honestly ridiculous. But I don't know why they did this. It's just as blatant and ignorant as the Somali section from Modern Warfare 3, but with even less grounds to be fighting them in the first place. It's not like Rojas is the leader of the militia, at least as far as I'm aware, so why does the favela come out to kill you? It's not like the game leads into it either. There's no tension building where you're being watched and someone does something to instigate a fight, which is how the entire level could be somewhat justified. No, it's just a couple of well-armed, highly trained and elite Western Special Forces going into a poor neighbourhood and basically just shooting the place up. That's it. You're called the good guys by the game, so it should figure that these men are the bad guys. There's probably some explanation somewhere that Makarov paid them off or that Rojas is actually the leader or something, but to me that just doesn't justify it. And only on replaying it for a different video did it really hit me just how on the nose this entire level is. I know what some people might be thinking, and that this is looking into it a bit too much, or alternatively, is only looking into it when approaching stereotyping and racism towards people of colour or minorities. However, there is certainly something to be said with how the series has approached nations such as Russia. In Modern Warfare 2019, a game which does actually try to make some observations to mixed results, there is a highway of death located in the fictional nation of Urzikstan. Now, this is obviously drawing inspiration from, and indeed is directly based off of, the real Highway of Death from the 1991 Persian Gulf War. However, where the real-life Highway of Death, Highway 80, was perpetrated by a Western coalition of US, British and French forces, Modern Warfare's interpretation pinned the blame on the invading Russian forces. This obviously didn't go down well in Russia, where the game is banned for a multitude of reasons, but it also didn't go down well domestically either. Many were quick to point out that it sure did look like an attempt at historical negationism, and not quite historical revisionism, which is what the Wikipedia article on the subject calls it. It's not trying to analyse history through a new lens, or it's not really trying to reinterpret what occurred, it's simply replacing what really happened in a real place with something else. It is negating the actual event, which, by the way, was pretty bad, whichever way you look at it. I'll leave the Wikipedia article link in the description for anyone who wants to have a look at it. It is just one instance, however, in a franchise littered with these stereotypes and generalizations, usually around the Russians, sure, but not exclusively. That's not to say at all, however, that all modern Call of Duty games miss tackling some interesting issues or don't have anything to say. I mean, of course they do. Advanced Warfare took the series in a brand new direction thematically, choosing to frame its story around a futuristic private military company, as opposed to following state-run special forces units or large armies. Jonathan Irons, the antagonist, is an amalgamation of your generic movie corporate villain and the modern-day Silicon Valley CEO. Charming, cunning, and ruthless to the nth degree. The plot was the first to take place in a world that was not only futuristic, but grounded. Even the jump packs, the feature on which the game was primarily marketed on, felt like they could actually exist. It's set in 2054, which is pretty much 30 years ahead of its only real contemporary, Black Ops 2, yet feels much more realistic and grounded than that game ever did. Or does. I mean, retrospective analysis of these games gets a bit more warped the longer it is you leave it. Considering that Black Ops 2 was set in 2025 and we're now in 2020, really puts into perspective how the technology on display there isn't the most realistic or down to earth per se, whereas the designs of nearly everything in Advanced Warfare, minus a few notable exceptions, feel that they could very well exist in the next 10 to 20 years at least. Modern Warfare 2019, for all of its flaws, at least attempted to call into question the ethics of contemporary combat and counter-terrorism operations. I don't really think it did this very well, for which I'll probably make a whole separate video on as a continuation of this, but as an evaluation, it doesn't actually attempt to treat things in these shades of grey that it advertised itself on. It hides the black and white choices under the guise of ambiguity. There are defined good and bad guys in that story, not the spectrum of morals that was teased. For this reason, many of its commentaries lose meaning and value to me. So, in conclusion, is Call of Duty a bad franchise? Not at all. In fact, it's one of my all-time favourites, and I am admittedly a sucker for buying the newest game each year. I usually find the campaigns to be enjoyable for the most part, and nearly always have a good time in the multiplayer, which is what I and many others consider to be the core experience. However, this doesn't mean that I can't be critical of it, and explore some of its themes with a critical eye. I believe Call of Duty did have an identity of thought-provoking undercurrents that was lost sometime in the early 2010s, which it is now trying to get back through games such as Modern Warfare 2019. Do I think it started to do things just for the money? Of course I do, especially with Modern Warfare 2's escapades, but I don't think that it is inherently a bad product or franchise. The people who produce it aren't bad people. They're not trying to promote bad messages, at least I hope not. It has more to do with how the themes became twisted over time before completely losing meaning. I am looking forward to the next COD, however, as I do every year, and hope with the speculative return to the Cold War, they use the platform of that incredibly dense and nuanced period of history to tell an interesting and provocative story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. My next few videos will be a departure from these sort of political themed essay things that I've been doing the last couple of videos, and will be focused more on actual video games themselves, so I do hope to see you around. Cheers.